Okay, welcome back. Next up, Stephen Aiello, who leads our security practice at Ahead. He'll be joined by colleague Logan Wilcox. They're going to discuss how to balance the needs of both your security teams in your organization and the business leaders who want the benefits, the speed, the flexibility of public cloud. After they wrap up, we'll go to another guest session. Tim Peterson, the CIO at Excel Energy, one of our clients, and some of his team members will take part in a discussion facilitated by Ahead's very own Derek Wise. Enjoy the sessions, ask questions, and then we'll wrap up day 2. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks for joining us today. We are going to be talking about security in the public cloud. It is certainly an interesting topic. There is an abundance of opinions out there. So I hope this session will be informative and educational. For every presentation that I do, I like to start off with a quote. And I thought this quote was especially applicable to the topic. And this one is from Sun Tzu. It says, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before the defeat." So when we think about developing a public cloud strategy, I like to keep that quote in mind. And you might see some themes throughout this presentation that reflect that mindset. So what specifically are we going to discuss today? Well, our objectives, we're going to learn how we can better defend our cloud environments. And there's 4 specific topics that we're going to be discussing. How to identify if you have a real strategy to secure your cloud platform. How can you leverage industry standards in order to augment your strategy? How you can take advantage of cloud services to enhance your existing security program. And then 4th and finally, how you can leverage automation and the power of APIs to enhance your security program. And this is really something powerful that the public cloud offers. So let's jump right into it. So first, how can we identify if you have a strategy to secure your cloud platform? And I like to use this analogy. I like an image and a definition. The definition of strategy is a detailed plan for achieving success in situations such as war, politics, business, industry, or sport, or the skill of planning for such a situation. And when I think about security, what I see is a lot of proliferation of tools. We think about all the tools that we're inundated. If you've ever been to RSA or however many vendors might be calling you. And when I think about that, I think about a hobbyist who has a hobby and they buy all the gear and gadgets. Maybe, I've been taking guitar lessons recently. So there's this urge for me to buy all these cool pedals and amps, but all that gear isn't going to make me a better guitar player. Maybe you have a friend who buys the best golf clubs every year, but they're just a horrible golfer. Those golf clubs aren't making them any better of a golfer. And so I think one of the things that we want to think about is, are tools a strategy? And the reality is they're not. Sometimes your tools just don't work. And I'm from Michigan. Sometimes our beloved Lions, they get the helmets knocked off their head. And so even though they have this defensive equipment, our strategy doesn't seem to work so well in the 3rd and 4th quarter, and our equipment fails us. And that's really important because historically, when we think about how security has been done on premises, it's been very tool driven. There are, of course, regulatory frameworks, but a strategy is not a regulatory framework. A strategy is something that you can identify from a big picture perspective. So one of the things we like to discuss with our customers is, how do you develop a simple strategy that you can measure its effectiveness? And so this might not be your strategy, but this is something that we could identify as the beginning of a strategy. If you look, for example, at the most common tactics, techniques, and procedures, otherwise known as TTPs, they're really common and almost everybody knows them. If you read something like the Verizon Data Breach Incident Report, you'll see that over 99% of data breaches comprise 6 actions and then lead to some result. And those 6 actions are email phishing, vulnerable web applications, installation of command and control. So that would be, getting a beachhead in your environment, capturing credentials or stealing passwords. People are very familiar with that. Lateral movement, which just simply means moving back and forth in the environment, being able to go from one system to another. And then people authenticate to data using those stolen credentials. You might think of an attacker stealing your username and password and then getting into your Office 365 account. And then the result of that is either data destruction, maybe in the form of ransomware, which most folks are familiar with, or through data exfiltration. They take the data and they steal maybe your intellectual property. And so the beginning of a strategy for you or your organization might be identifying the threats that are specific to you. And if you're in energy, maybe you have critical infrastructure that you would need to add to this list and specific threats there. If you're in the medical field, maybe there's biomedical devices you have to be concerned with. But ultimately, what we want to do is we want to evaluate those processes that support the defense of those TTPs, work with the organization to establish a baseline of what the current risk posture is and identify the gaps between current state and desired state. And then finally, create a plan of action for processes, tooling, people that help mitigate those technologies. So when you think of something, how are you developing a strategy versus just acquiring tools? Second, how can we leverage industry standards to augment our strategy? And I love this cartoon here. And I feel it really illustrates the InfoSec ecosystem very well. We are very concerned with, as it says, firewalls, encryption, antivirus software, all of those things. And then it says in this other corner, we have Dave, which is human error. And although people are fantastic, we do make a lot of mistakes. And what the industry is sort of driven to has a tendency to be checkbox compliance. Do we have a DLP system? Do we have a web application firewall? And those things, they're not a strategy in and of themselves. But when we think about stepping back, well, how would we stop an attacker from getting into our environment, let's say via email phishing, right? Well, first we have to identify our targets. And then we have to identify the process that we want to use to protect those targets. And then we have these standards that allow us and give us good ideas on how to technically execute those steps. And as you can see here, some of those standards are PCI for the payment card industry, HITRUST, which is very commonly used in the healthcare industry, NIST in folks that need to deal with the federal government. So those are all things that supplement a strategy. They are not a strategy in and of themselves. And that's something that's very important, because if you blindly follow all the checks and the checkboxes for all those compliance initiatives, you will end up with a mountain of equipment, a mountain of products, but no real strategy that those products are aligned to. And so how would we put this into practice? So here, for those of you that are deep into security, you might recognize some of these things on the screen. On the left-hand side, we have what's referred to as the critical security controls. They're from the Center for Internet Security. And on the right-hand side, we have what's called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And these are just some excerpts from both. So if you look at MITRE, that is really common tactics that people use. In this case, these are subcategories of lateral movement, which we spoke about. So it might be exploiting a remote service, internal spear phishing, lateral tool transfer. These are all things that attackers do and have been shown to do in the wild. And then those critical security controls provide protection and coverage in order to minimize the risk and potentially stop the attacker from being able to execute these specific actions in your environment. So when you're thinking about the strategy and you're thinking about the common industry frameworks that supplement your strategy, the thought process should always be, how do I apply this strategy and these response processes to the techniques that the attackers are going to use? And if you don't have a need for something, you shouldn't buy a product for it. You should, properly evaluate your risk in alignment with your strategy. Now, this is something that is, I think, one of the most important things as organizations move to the public cloud. What should they be considering? And that is, how do you take advantage of cloud native services in order to enhance your security program? And this is a really important question, right? And I'm going to start off with a little bit of humor. So here we have the most interesting man in the world, or in our case, it's the most interesting CIO or CTO in the world. And we've worked with so many organizations where we'll be talking to their technical stakeholders and they'll say, our CTO has told us that we need to move 75% of our infrastructure into public cloud in 18 months. And when we think about that, timeline, and we think about the change in paradigm that causes for the staff, that can be very daunting. And if you compare that to the evolution of how we've managed IT infrastructure before, you can see that it's drastically different. This adoption of public cloud is so much more rapid than we've had to deal with previously. So if you think about the previous 20 years, when I was getting started, it was the transition from Novell NetWare to Windows NT 4. I forget what service pack and option pack. But there was that transition from Novell to NT. And that was a pretty major shift. I remember my mentor was a huge Novell engineer. And for him to make that transition was very difficult. But then from Windows NT and then specifically Windows 2000, we've had a little bit of ebb and flow, how we've managed our environment. VMware was in there. But if you look at the operating systems and how we manage those operating systems, where most of the attacks occur, we've had almost 20 years to really learn, grow with the platform, understand the nuances of the platform, things like group policy and how we can leverage those native tools within our infrastructure to secure it. And where it's been 20 years historically, now we're trying to make leaps and bounds into a public cloud platform in months. These projects are very demanding. They're often very business critical. And so folks are struggling to really understand how to educate themselves and how to, make use of cloud platforms in order to secure their environment. And so when we interface with customers and interface with organizations, we like to do so in three ways, right? One, we want to understand and assess that current state, right? What are you doing today? How are you executing your processes? Secondly, it's so important that we educate our partners. As we're working through engagements with our partners, it's absolutely critical that as security professionals, we're bringing folks into the cloud platform, showing them how they can use these cloud native tools to complement and augment their existing security platforms and give them the education that they need so they can be competent in order to secure the cloud platform. Imagine if you were, to take a Unix engineer from the 60s, say 60s or 70s or even 80s, and then you took them into a really large, complex Active Directory environment. The person knew nothing about Windows, let's say, knew nothing about Active Directory, and you just said, secure this. What do you think the likelihood of success would be for that Unix admin in securing that highly complex Windows Active Directory environment? Their chance for success would be very, very minimal. And yet what we're seeing in the market is because of the lack of education for security resources, quite frankly, even by the cloud native vendors, the ability for security practitioners to secure these cloud environments is hampered drastically. And then finally, there always has to be a plan of action, right? There always has to be a plan of action. How do we take that education? How do we assess that current state and develop a plan to really move people forward? And this is something that every security leader, every security engineer, that's what they should be thinking about. Assess, educate, action. That's critically important. And it doesn't mean it has to be complex. It can be something very simple. It doesn't mean it has to be an expensive tool that you buy. So for example, one of the things that we like to work with folks on is how do you use those cloud native services too, right? And how would you alert on failed logins into your cloud environment? And it could be something so simple like, you take CloudWatch event rules and then send that data to an SNS topic. So here's an example. I was logging into my lab environment last night and I just forgot my password. And so every failed login that I had until I logged in as the root account, it was, texting me on my phone. It costed me $0. There was no product for me to buy there. But because of the knowledge that I have about the cloud native services, I was immediately able to alert myself of, when I was logging in improperly, or if somebody else was trying to log into my environment improperly. And there's a whole host of things you can do with cloud native tools without needing any additional support. Or in some cases, like Logan is about to show us, you can actually integrate services that the public cloud provider offers you in with your existing security stack. So what Logan's going to jump into, he's going to talk about how you can integrate Event Hub within Microsoft Azure and send those specific events that you're looking for into Splunk so they can be consumed and digested by your security team in an easy and understandable way. So Logan, we'll have you kick that off.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is Logan Wilcox, and as Stephen said, I'm going to be talking about how we can integrate Azure Event Hubs with Splunk Enterprise. If you're not familiar with Azure Event Hubs, it is a big data streaming platform and event ingestion service that can receive and process millions of events per second. We use these event hubs to store events, data, or telemetry produced by software and devices in Azure. We can then gain further use of this data in Splunk, where we can create complex visualizations, reports, alerts, and more. The first step in this process is going to be to create our Event Hubs namespace. So if we click on Search and we navigate to Event Hubs, this is where we can configure our namespace. You'll do so by selecting the Add button in the top left corner. Then you'll specify a subscription, a resource group, give your namespace a unique name, location, and then Azure recommends that we go with the standard pricing tier. Once you're finished with that, you can select Review and Create, and Azure will deploy your namespace. Once your namespace has been deployed, you can click on it right here, and this will open up a menu with some basic metrics and information about your namespace. From there, to create your Event Hub, you'll go to Entities, select Event Hubs, and then click on Add Event Hub. Here, all you have to configure is the name for your Event Hub, and then press Create. Once your Event Hub has been deployed within your namespace, you can click on the name to access the rest of its settings. And the last step in this process will be to click on Shared Access Policies in Settings, click on Add, and then we're going to add a shared access policy for Splunk Enterprise. Once this is all complete, the next step is going to be to install the Microsoft Azure add-on for Splunk. And this application will need to be installed on both the search head and the heavy forwarder server. The heavy forwarder is used for the collection of the data, and then the search head is used for the parsing of the data. Once you have both of these, once you have this application installed on both of your servers, we're going to jump to the heavy forwarder first. When you're in your heavy forwarder, we'll go to the Microsoft Azure add-on for Splunk. And when this loads up, the first place we're going to go is the configuration page right here. Then we'll go to Account. And what you're going to have to do here is click on Add. And Splunk is going to ask for a client ID and a client secret. And these will be available when you create a Azure Active Directory application. When you do that, it'll provide the client ID and the client secret, which you will then place here. Once this is done, you're going to go over to your inputs. We'll click on this green button to add a new input and select Azure Event Hub. And here we're going to enter our name, interval of collection, the index we would like to use. And then the one thing you're going to have to grab from Azure is the connection string. And the way you can get that is by going back to your Event Hub, clicking on your shared access policy, clicking the name of that policy, and you're going to copy this connection string primary key. Once you have that here, you can configure the rest of these and click Add, and then your namespace and Event Hub is ready to use in Splunk. From there, we can jump over to the search head, and if I want to find this data, just specify the index that you used during configuration. As you can see, events are now available in my Azure Monitor index, and this allows for easy creation of dashboards, reports, alerts, or anything else that Splunk provides as a feature. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Stephen, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Logan. That was a great demo. And hopefully for some of you that are in the Azure platform and possibly using Splunk, that will be a bit of education that you can use to start connecting your two environments. Now, the last thing that we want to talk about, and this is critically important in the public cloud, is how to leverage automation and APIs to enhance your security program. And this is something that I had learned by, a need. My team was escalated to every time that there was a security event that our internal our internal IT staff was just not equipped to handle. And so I started to ask my team, how much time are we spending on this when we have to assist our internal IT team? And depending on the level of resource, whether they're more junior or senior, they would say, anywhere between 60 minutes or an hour to do, an investigation. And when I think about that, I think about how it was taking my team time that, quite frankly, we didn't have because we need to be in front of customers. We need to be educating them, assessing where they're at, and helping them build a plan. I just realized that we had to do this in a better way. So several years ago, we started significantly investing in security automation. And what used to take us on average, let's say 75 minutes, 60 to 90 minutes, we can get done in 2 minutes. And the power of the public cloud really opens up so many opportunities for this. So, for example, if we have an alert that we get in from our endpoint system, and we're able to identify that that system lives in Azure, we can do a complete investigation. Our endpoint system in all of our product portfolio was picked because we knew that we wanted to go down a security automation route. All of these platforms and products were picked with their API capabilities in mind. Now, what does that mean? Because this is really important. There's a lot of nuance here. But what a rich and robust set of APIs should include is all of the CRUD verbs. And for those of you that are developers, you'll recognize it immediately. But for those of you that are not, I'll give it a quick explanation. CRUD is an acronym for create, read, update, delete. So when we think about the types of actions that we want to be able to take within our environment, if we get an alert, let's say from our EDR solution, and that goes into our SIEM, and then we want to do some investigation. Maybe we want to cross-reference that alert from our EDR solution with our firewall logs. So we can say, this is the system, this is the source IP address or the source host. Then we're going to look through the firewall logs that we have in our SIEM, cross-reference every connection made from that host in those firewall logs. Look at what geographies was the system communicating with. We do business primarily in the US. Is a system communicating with Russia or Iran or whatever nation state that you might not expect it to communicate with? Is it communicating with a Tor exit node? Is it communicating unexpectedly with AWS or Azure? And by having those APIs available, it actually allows us to go in and make an update on that device. It's the U in the CRUD verb, right? And by making an update on the device, let's say we suspected some ransomware to be, acting on that device, we could immediately just isolate that device and cut it off from the rest of the network. We have the power to affect change on that device because we can update the profile. Let's say that same device, it was a web server, let's say, in a scale set or an auto scaling group. Because of the APIs that are available in public cloud platforms, we could make that call and say, we need to remove this device from an auto scaling group, take a snapshot of it, put it in an object store, and then let that cloud platform redeploy a new healthy system. So when you're thinking about the power of security automation, that needs to be a consideration, bringing it all the way back to your strategy. Can we use the power of the APIs that are available in the public cloud to inform our strategy? And if you can really start to focus on the things that drive value within the organization. You don't necessarily need to have people responding to alerts, doing those investigations, shutting down systems. You allow them to do that higher value work. So thank you for talking to us today. And what we're going to do now is we are going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat, and either I can address them from the chat or our moderator can pass. All right. Thank you all. I bumped my camera there. So thanks for chatting with us. got one question that I think is pretty interesting. One that says, how do teams traditionally that had distinct roles come together and evolve when organizations are trying to integrate security into their cloud environment? And this is pretty interesting. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. This is a pretty interesting topic because to properly secure public cloud, it really requires that folks that used to be able to operate in silos come together. When you think about traditional data center, the network team, for example, they were responsible for connectivity and they didn't necessarily have to be as involved in the application stack. The same thing when I think about configuration management, let's say Puppet or Chef, those individual resources weren't necessarily involved in the structure and planning of the network. So I think one of the things that we've learned from a lesson perspective is that teams really need to collaborate to a significantly higher degree in the public cloud than they previously were used to doing. So what is the number one issue from security configuration that you see going to the cloud? This sort of piggybacks on the previous question. I think with all of the organizations that we've done work with, almost very, very few of them had put a priority on the configuration of the actual operating system or the deployment of the application layer. And I think this has to do with the fact that we work with very large enterprises. And what we've seen is that very large enterprises have started with a lift and shift model versus building a net new application in the public cloud. And because of that, they're just deploying COTS apps, commercial off-the-shelf applications. They haven't taken the time to build like Puppet or Chef recipes or Puppet manifests. And it makes configuration management really, really difficult. So I think that's really important from a configuration perspective. And the whole, Jason, the whole mindset of infrastructure as code. From our security practice, if your security team is not driving toward an infrastructure as code model, you're likely to be defeated very quickly. And the reason is because most business teams or most development teams are moving so fast in the public cloud that if the security team is not implementing security controls in a fashion of code, if they don't know how to review CloudFormation templates or ARM templates or Terraform templates, if they don't know how to look at that data as code and you don't have some sort of version control and change control process around that, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep up. So Jerry, how portable are these tools processes when you have hybrid of public cloud and not? Oh, this is a really good question. So how portable are these tools and processes? So this is something that we're asked a lot. And specifically when organizations have a multi-cloud strategy, and this seems to happen a lot in healthcare. They might be using some Azure resources because they have a Microsoft ELA, they have Office 365 that they're leveraging. But then there's some sort of data science group or some sort of research group that wants to go to AWS, or Google has been really popular, it seems, in the medical space. So when you think about cloud, I'll take this in two parts. How portable are the cloud native security tools? And then how portable are the security tools that are third party? Some of the cloud native security tools can cross platform. So for example, if you consider like a Microsoft Azure Sentinel, Microsoft specifically seems to be focusing on this, where they're trying to have their tool stack be able to feed into other cloud providers. So that is beneficial. What we've noticed is that there's still, those platforms are still evolving. And so when we look at a tool like Azure Sentinel, there's still a lot of work to be done there. It's very powerful, but you have to bring a lot of your own manual labor. And And now third-party tools, they're great. If you look at like a Palo Tools or Dome9, whatever it may be, they're really great because they can span all of those cloud providers. And I'm not saying one is good or bad. I just want to share with you the pros and cons that we've seen. The downside of those third-party tools, and this is sort of what I've seen across all of them, they'll say, hey, we've got this tool, right, that's going to solve this problem, which is never true. You plug this thing into your cloud environment, and it fires off so many alerts, right? Like hundreds of thousands, thousands of alerts, hundreds of alerts. And I've seen teams get so spun up and consumed just trying to dodge and weave alerts that they're not spending the time that they could be spending to go back and just secure the cloud platform. So you've got some pros and cons, right? The cloud native tools, not as cross-platform, not as friendly. The third-party tools, they do a lot, but that means a lot of operational overhead. And I've seen a lot of sort of busy work come from that. So thank you, Jerry, for that question. Manesh, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. I apologize if I'm not. In terms of a cloud ops team, what roles do you see as needed to be successful? All of them, I guess I would say. I feel like based on our experience, a lot of organizations have moved to the public cloud and just think everything will work. And that's sort of true. It's sort of true. Just like I was a Windows guy for a long time, so I'm going to pick on Windows. Just sort of like when you set up a Windows environment, it just sort of works. And generally because there was a lot of usability features that were enabled that also allowed from some security vulnerabilities. I'm going to give you a really great example. For any of you that are in Microsoft Azure, go look at any default network security, NSG, and you'll notice that basically those default NSGs allow traffic from anywhere else in the Microsoft ecosystem. So if you're trying to segment by security boundary, you really need to go in and above those default rules, add some firewall rules that lock things down a little bit more. So you will need a network person that understands network constructs in your cloud of choice. You will need a configuration management person that understands how to handle configuration management, Puppet or Chef. I think that's like one of the biggest things you can do from a security posture perspective. You need somebody that understands infrastructure as code. You need to have a good relationship with your application owners. This is a huge problem we see, and make sure I'm not, okay. This is a huge problem we see in almost every organization that we work with. There's been sort of this stone wall between the application owners and the infrastructure team and the network team, quite frankly. The application owners cannot tell you, oh, well, I need these 3 ports, and that's what I need for my application. That really becomes critically important in the public cloud if you're trying to minimize the capability for an attacker to move laterally, let's say. It's not especially different than on-premises. It's something that we should have been doing on premises, right? We don't want every port and protocol to be open, like most networks are, unfortunately. But specifically, as you're trying to manage your infrastructure as code, if you're trying to manage ports and protocols, the application team needs to give you that information. That's a huge, huge problem that I see. So Manesh, again, sorry for your name. My lack of being able to pronounce it. The answer is still all of the teams that you would be used to having on-prem today, and the level of depth that all of those teams need to come together. Okay. So what was the question here? Thank you for letting me know that you lost me. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, ServiceNow CMDB quality. If you have something like a service catalog that is sitting in front of your cloud platform, then if you're going through the catalog and you're selecting pre-approved assets or pre-approved services or EC2 instances or Azure virtual machines, whatever it is you're selecting, as part of that deployment process into the public cloud, then hopefully that same service catalog that is deploying those resources into your public cloud environment is also updating your CMDB. Now, this becomes a little bit interesting when you have things like scale sets and auto scaling groups in Azure or AWS. But that's more of a philosophical conversation. Do we treat the base AMI or virtual machine image and have that in our CMDB DB, or do we add an update? A little bit more of a philosophical conversation. But two things: absolutely having a service catalog can help you, get your asset information up to date as long as people are using the service catalog. The other thing that we've seen is there are tools on the market that it's more on the endpoint space that have pre-built integrations specifically into the ServiceNow platform. So, for example, if you have an endpoint and there is a pre-built integration, not only will it tell you when that asset is on the network or not on the network, but it can update you in real time as far as packages that are installed on that endpoint, which can feed into the CMDB. So yes, there are many ways that you can deal with that. Sort of a third party is more of a brute force approach. You're just constantly going out and polling the environment. I would say the recommended way would to have some sort of service catalog, live and die by infrastructure as code. Even your security team should be living and dying by infrastructure as code, and make sure that all of those resources are deployed in a controlled manner. The biggest thing that we have seen from our customer base, and we have customers that are very large, they built out a cloud environment and then they just managed it like they managed their on-premises data centers. And they scrapped it. And they're like, okay, this is Gen 2 of our cloud environment. Rebuilt it again from the ground up. And we just sort of finished a consulting engagement with them. And because specifically configuration management wasn't in place and there wasn't a holistic service catalog, now they're talking about scrapping it again and building Gen 3. So you don't want to do that. So we have 5,000 existing servers. We want to bring automation to the brown field. How do we improve CMDB to prepare for the environment for automation? So, shameless plug, Ahead does have an absolutely fantastic ESM. And for us, that means ServiceNow. We absolutely have a fantastic team that can help you with that. What I would say is that it really starts off with understanding your use cases. So even if we're going in and we're doing work, let's say, and the main focus is, let's say, just CMDB, to have an updated list of assets for general governance, or let's say monitoring licensing entitlements. Just use that as an example. That use case will be fairly different than we want ServiceNow to be our source of truth from a security perspective. Therefore, we need to know not just everything that we purchase licenses for, but all of those oddball things that you don't think about, like Google Chrome, right? There's a lot of things that happen in browsers from an exploit perspective. So those are all, it's just, if you do end up speaking to one of our folks from the ESM team, it is really important that, everybody be a part of that conversation, not just the service desk, but the security team and, the data center team. And it really goes back to looking for platforms that have great APIs. ServiceNow absolutely does have great APIs. And as you're thinking about that deployment process, whether it's on premises in your legacy data center or as you're moving to public cloud, making sure, asking the question, is this automated? If it's not automated, why is it not automated? That's really important. Automation is king, right? That's absolutely critical. Great questions. Anything else? Think we're good? All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all the wonderful questions. Sorry for the audio glitch there. And next, what I'm going to be doing is turning you over to Derek Wise. He is one of our principal consultants here at Ahead. So thank you so much. Derek, you're up next.